The German archives can provide so much more than just genealogical information. They can tell you about the life and times of your ancestors. This was really the most interesting part of my research. I loved finding the details of my ancestors' lives, how they lived, their struggles and successes. What I will share with you today is based upon my research doing Jewish genealogy. But the information can be used for doing your research on your Jewish or Christian ancestors, and also can be applied to many German-speaking archives. Also, perhaps you'll learn a little bit about the history of the Jews in the German states. Let me give you a very short introduction how I started my personal journey. I grew up looking at these two old oil paintings hanging above my grandfather's fireplace in his apartment in New York City. I was very young at the time. I didn't ask any questions. I had no inkling how important Joseph David Berlesheimer and his wife Gustl Katz Berlesheimer would become to me over the years. I was able to uncover so much about their lives that they became much more than just portraits. The story began in 1992 when an elderly distant cousin gave me these pages of a handwritten family register. I didn't speak any German, couldn't read any German, but he showed me the name Berlesheimer. That, of course, I knew. But then he showed me the name Gundelfinger. Never heard of that. And the town of Michelbach. Never heard of that. And then he showed me at the top of the page the name of the village of Murigen. For any of you who are German speakers, please excuse my accent. I learned just to read the German. I never learned to pronounce it correctly. All I had known was that my great-grandfather had come to America in the mid-19th century from Germany. Before my husband and I went to Europe so he could study German in a language institute in Frankfurt, I just threw those pages in my suitcase. I had assumed that due to the destruction wrought by the Second World War, that I wouldn't be able to find any information about my ancestors. Nevertheless, with a lot of time on my hands, I decided to go to the village of my ancestors. And you can see here the area that I was involved with, and Frankfurt is up here. It's about 3 to 4 hours south. Well, as I said, I didn't speak any German, so I knew it would be an adventure. This adventure became a project. The project became an obsession. From 1994 to 1998, we spent every summer doing research in the German archives. I also did research in Bavaria, in the German-speaking areas of Prussia around Posen, and also in Bohemia. From the beginning, I knew that I would end my research before the 20th century, because as we will know, there are so many books written about the people who lived in Germany in the 20th century. Today, no Jews live in this village of Murigen. You can see here on this 1830 view the synagogue right across the street from the Catholic Church. The population of Murigen in the middle of the 19th century was about 1,200, including 500 Jews. While there were some special rules and restrictions for the Jews, in doing the genealogical research, you really do it exactly the same way as any of you would do looking for your Christian ancestors. Of course, I'm going to have to simplify history to move along with what I'm going to tell you today. We don't know what documents are in each archive. So for today, we're going to assume the best of all possible worlds, that every document you want is going to be in every archive. As I said, I did not speak German. And for this talk, I'm going to assume you don't either. But what I'm going to try and show you is how you identify the documents you want to photocopy, to bring back to America, where you will hopefully find volunteers who will help you translate the documents. And this is what happened to me. My husband's non-Jewish tax clients spent hours and hours translating for me, and I certainly could not have done the book without all their help. So let's see what you're going to find. Two phrases could be repeated over and over again. I didn't know, I didn't know. And also, I don't know how you did this. My attitude is, if I could do it, I didn't speak German, I didn't actually know how to do any genealogical research, you all can do it as well. And one part of it that I still, even today, get such a thrill, when you go to an archive and touch a fragile, yellowed piece of paper that has your family name on it, or you find a signature, you just get chills. I know we are so used to doing the microfilms, but when you see the real document and you are in the village of your ancestors, it's something that if you can do it, you really need to. So, what documents did I find about my ancestors? We're going to start with the details and then broaden out to the larger events. This is a typical family register, which you can find in the parish churches or in the civil archives. And they're set up the same all the way across. You have the date of birth of the house father, and then you have the date of the marriage, the wife, and her date of birth. And you can see sometimes it says the place where the wife was born. Then below that you have where the parents, the names of the parents and where they were born. And if you move it up, please. You will have the names of the children, when they were born, when they were confirmed, when they got married, and when they died. Now, in South Germany, in Baden-Württemberg, they actually have very lovely family registers. I found in Bavaria, they just wrote them out longhand in paragraph form. But if you know what you're looking for, you can still identify the names. Each of these family registers usually has an index at the end, and you can see the family names listed under the correct letter. Now, the problem with this is they only list the fathers. So inevitably, you're going to have to go through these books one by page to look for the female lines. In some places, they also had birth registers. And these would be listed by year. And you probably don't know the name of the child, or maybe you do, so you look what's easier. For me, it was always easier to find the family name because it was long. And then you would look to see the child's name, and you would find the date of birth. Other places to find birth information are in the apprenticeship and emigration applications. These birth registers also listed if the child was born out of wedlock, and they use the Latin word spurious, right there. And they usually said who the father was if they knew it. And in other cases, and I found this very interesting, is that in the family register itself, they listed the name of the mother, who was a child of the father, and then her child, which obviously meant that this was a child out of wedlock. Now, through other documents, I was able to track down that father, and he did have to pay for child support. You'll be glad to know. In respect to death information, really those family registers, as you notice, didn't have a column for death. So once in a while, they would write that information underneath the name. Of course, we have the cemetery documentation that's held in the churches. But also, there was a civil record that was kept because it was very important that someone was not buried within 48 hours, before 48 hours, because there was the Victorian fear of burying somebody alive. So they always registered how many, it was to the minute. But what it is that sometimes this information was not correct. For instance, my Joseph was listed as Jacob, and I know he's 94 years old, and they listed him as 97, but it was obviously the same person. They always listed the causes of death, and this always fascinated me. For him, it was weakness of age. I would say he was pretty weak by that time. Sugar disease, which was diabetes, lung disease, paralysis, which I think was like strokes. Gathering information about our ancestors before the 18th century is tough for all of us. And this is when we really have to build on the research that the archivists and historians have done for us. This is a book that was done by an archivist, actually a director of a state archive, who went to Bohemia every summer for 10 summers. And he did research in the castles owned by a prince that owned this whole area. So when I met him, I said, oh, yay, I want to go, I want to go, I want to do it too. And he said, forget it. You know, it's up in a big castle, and they wouldn't let you in as a non-researcher, non-professional. And also, it was completely disorganized. So what we have to do is take advantage of the information that people like this had gathered. And for instance, in his book, he had lists and lists of tax lists that he had done every 10 years. He almost did a census of the taxpayers. Now, just a little bit of Jewish history, you can see that here, none of the Jews had surnames, which is another topic, but the Jews did not take on surnames till the 19th century, which of course is different than your Christian ancestors. So here it actually makes it much more difficult for people who are doing Jewish genealogy. But in the local archives, you can start to find either 17th century or 18th century documents. This is a tax list because, as you can well imagine, they were constantly keeping track of who was paying their taxes. And sometimes you could also find information about where the people were from. For instance, this is one of my cat's ancestors, and it said he was from Nicholsburg. That was not on the family registers. And it turned out that Nicholsburg had a large Jewish community, but that was over in Bohemia. So he came a long way, I have no idea why, to live in South Germany. But this was information that I got from this tax list, which was from 1766, excuse me. Unlike most family researchers, I began my research in Germany without any experience and had no idea what I was doing. In fact, the first year I didn't even have a pencil with me. So what I was able to do was find out about my family firsthand, which is really very exciting. I don't encourage it because there's no reason to go through what I went through, but you can do it. And what we can learn about the emigration from documents in the German archives is actually more than what we usually find through the LDS microfilms. Here is a family register, and you can see that a few people went to America. And it's amazing how many times I go back to these family registers to see who went and things like that. And then the civil authorities also kept the records of who was leaving, because people were leaving, they were losing an asset in their community. So these were not by religion by any means, it was by date when people left. And you can see that people went to Baden. Someone went to Baden actually to be a teacher. North America, some people were very fancy with the North America. And this also helps you with the female lines, because if somebody left for marriage, they had to be approved that they were leaving and that they were going into the next place. So these are really useful registers, and they are in the state archives. Some of them have been microfilmed, some of them have not. And then you have the immigration documents, which you can, most of them are available on the LDS microfilms, but again, I found them in real paper to begin with. Another source for immigration information are the local newspapers, the official local newspapers, when they would list everybody who left. And this was really good because you could see when they applied compared to when we see them in Germans to America, and in between or right around them, they would also publish in the local newspaper. And you can here see a Berlesheimer who was single, from Murrigan, left, and another one. And this is also a good way of seeing who left at the same time. Another source of information for immigration and emigration are the curator list. Now, this is one of those areas that takes a while to go through. But if you go through these records, anybody who had an inheritance that was due to them had to either accept the money or say, I don't want it. So what they would do is they would keep track of where everybody was and when they went to America and how much was owed to them. And in one of these files, because these are files of just random pieces of paper in relation to this, if they were in America, they had to have a notary or certification from the Württemberg consulate, this time in Cincinnati, saying, we don't want the money. So I had no idea, but from this document, I found that one of the Berlesheimers settled in the city of Davenport, Iowa. Of course, then I was able to research him there, but I never would have known if I just hadn't gone through every piece of paper and found this one sheet. Migration. Again, that's so important because so many of our ancestors started out in the little villages and then moved to the cities. As I said, this had to be documented because in Germany, even today, you have to say where you are. And this situation was something that I had not expected. That first summer, I was sitting outside the Adler Inn, which was the main big building owned by the barons still. And I was sitting there with a local historian who had been helping me rummage around the archive. And we were sitting outside because the village of Mürgen no longer has a bakery, no longer has a butcher, no longer has a restaurant. So I would bring a picnic lunch and a couple of beers, and we would sit and he would sit and translate the documents that we had found. And this time he read Moses Katz, a name I recognized from the family registers, living in Rottweil. Well, I didn't even know where Rottweil was, and the historian had no idea that Moses Katz had ever done business there. So this opened a whole new area of my research. These are my cousins who are now in their 90s and the biggest fans of my fan club. And Stan, can you lift up? Oh, way up, way up, way, so I can see this one. Yeah. And this is as children in the village of Mürgen, and you can see she has her favorite doll with her, and he has his little lamb. Of course, I interviewed everybody I could, although my research was before the times that they knew about. And on my website, I do have a model interview and also a food questionnaire that you certainly are welcome to download for free, because just give you some other questions that maybe you never thought of asking your relatives. But what I found is they really didn't know about the life before the time of their grandparents. So for that, we had to go into the archives. Let me share with you a few logistical points that I just touch on in the syllabus. You're probably going to be on your own in the smaller archives. Perhaps somebody's going to unlock it for you, but in general, you're on your own. And so that's why I did that list in the syllabus of all the types of documents you should be looking for, because they'll either have an inventory list that you can look at, or you're just going to have to hunt till you find what you're looking for. This is quite organized now, but actually when I started, it was a complete mess. But what I learned from the beginning is whenever I took out a volume, I had a long sheet of paper, and what I would do is I would write down on the piece of paper what the volume looked like. So this one, I would say brown cover with torn right center, because I couldn't read any German. And then, if I saw some numbers, I would just make a little picture, because you don't want to mess up the archive organization for yourself or for anybody else that ever wants to go in and do archival information. I did find that very few people do research in these small archives, and the dust is incredible. And unfortunately, the humidity is a problem, because in many places their documents are not taken care of correctly. And in some places, I literally could see the bugs eating holes in the volumes as we were looking at them. Also, you have to realize that the Germans have years, months, decades to do their research. And they for some reason, never photocopy anything. They either write it down longhand or they will do it now into their laptop. And this summer I was in the Prussian archive in Berlin, which is a very scholarly, a long way from Murrigan, let's say it this way. And everybody was sitting there writing down. I could see them while I was whipping through these things. They were sitting there. And I wanted to yell out, photocopy, you know, because I couldn't. And I'd come back the next day. They're still writing. I mean, it was nuts. Unless there was some secret that I didn't know about. I don't know why they didn't photocopy what they were looking at. But the problem is that it takes a long time sometimes to get the photocopies back. For instance, Stuttgart, the State Archive, takes several weeks. They send you the bill, and then you pay them, and then they send you the materials. The Prussian State Archive is 6 weeks. Who knows when I'm going to get those. So you have to be aware of that when you're planning your research. Of course, the local archives, they usually have very poor quality photocopy machines, and they break easily. So you have to balance it all out. You should check with the archives to see if you're allowed to use digital cameras or handheld scanners. I would think for the local archives they wouldn't care. I know for the state archives, I checked with them recently, they said no. But it's worth asking because I should think that would change constantly. And it certainly would be a help. Well, as I said, researching the larger picture will take more time, but actually it's a lot more fun. So let's start with what we can learn that broadens out our picture of our ancestors. Let's start with the occupations. We all want to know what our ancestors did. The family registers, again, do not have a place to write that, but very often they would just write it right under the person's name. Here he was a tradesman, and this one is one of my favorite ones. He was a soap boiler. Now that to me did not sound like a great occupation, but it actually went down in the family. And you also find the trades in these lists of trade registers. And on those pages, they list each person, their trade, and what they paid in trade tax. And so here, forget it. I couldn't read that word in a million years. You can see how long the typical German word is. It was translated, and now he actually had a cotton wool factory. But here's the family name, and that's all you need, and then what years he paid tax. The apprenticeship registers, which were kept either by the guilds or the civil organizations of the archives, also told you what trade the family was in. Now, unfortunately, this guy was a rag dealer, and this man was a tradesman. And then it says what the son was training to do. Other sources of occupations. Anytime they had a petition or a contract or a house sale or a ground list, you name it, they usually put the name of the person, comma, what he did. And also, they would also put it before someone's name. So here, oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. How did that get out of the way? All right, the other, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. This is a master brief, which many people have in their family, and sometimes was put in, let's say, their inheritance documents for showing what level they were in. So this man was a shoemaker. Okay?
Hopefully this is the right one.
Yes, this is the right one. So here you can see how they just stuck the name of what they did. This man had a pub, and they would just write it in times, whatever they were writing it, information. Now, you can see what we're doing here. All you need to know is a person's name for what we're looking for, and everything else you find out when you get home. Looking patiently through the newspapers, and this means patiently. You go through page by page. Sometimes they had indexes, but most of the time they didn't. And you would find advertisements from your family members. I love this part. And here's one from Moses Katz, who had a store, and he signed it, of course, Moses Katz, and he sold all kinds of cloth and different types of materials like woolens and cashmeres. And he said he went to the Frankfurt market, which probably would have taken about 2 weeks to get there at that time because it was like 4 hours driving, even today. So you can imagine it was a seasonal market and probably took a month back and forth for the whole transaction. House ownership is another area that we all want to know about. When did they buy their house? Where was it located? How much did it cost? And what did it look like? This 18th century document was a whole volume of people who owned houses. And you can see it has the people's names and if they owned a garden or whatever or a building. Again, you would just be looking for your family name, and when you get home, you'll find out what they had. I found in the contracts book that in 1788, Moses Katz bought 2 apartments in a building that was owned by the baron. And then in 1796, and this is quite early for Jewish people at the time, he bought this house, which was located right across from the Adler Inn that I told you that's still standing here today. Oh, excuse me, can you just put that back? And here you can see the castle of the Baron on the hill, and it still stands today. Descendants living in America went back in 1912, and here's the house still standing, and I went back, and here it is, still standing, looking very much the same. And now this house is for sale, and it turns out that the founder of the Berlitz School of Languages was born here, and I just heard that they're putting a plaque up on the building. Maybe the owners wanted to go raise the price of the house, I don't know. And if you want to know the whole Berlitz story, it's on my website again, or I have a printout at my booth, which is 512, so you're welcome to come down and hear the story. In the contracts book, I found the contract from 1796 when Moses Katz. Now, am I going through these documents? I'm only looking for Moses Katz. I don't care what anything else says. Moses Katz, photocopy. Berlesheimer, photocopy. You're going to photocopy a lot of garbage because the first year I never knew when anything ended. So I got to keep on photocopying. So it was a lot of stuff was throwaway. You have a lot of scratch paper. But you want to be sure that you're going to get what you're going to get. Now, Moses Katz was pretty easy because he signed his name in Hebrew. So I could whip through and see, what was signed in Hebrew. But that usually doesn't happen quite so easily. These contract books usually list only the seller. So unless you have a hint from a local history book like I did, you do have to go through and look for all the buyers. In these contracts and in the fire insurance registers that I showed you earlier, they tell you how many floors in the building, how many bake ovens, how many heat ovens, and they really tell you quite a bit about the building. This is Baron von Munch, who owned the castle and still owns the castle, his descendants, in the village of Murrigan. And he had one of his managers collect the taxes in the town. And it's not surprising that being a citizen was so important for both Christians and Jews because, and this is a concept that we really have to learn about, is that the rights you have in your local little community were very important. For instance, you got a special price on firewood. And you also got to be allowed to pasture your animals on the communal pasture land. These were very important. And we find lists of citizens. So you can find out when your ancestor became a citizen. Now, usually the Christians became citizens because they were the son of a citizen. The Jews had to go through a different process, and my ancestor was the first Jew to become a citizen in 1835. But you can see it lists it, and also when they moved someplace, they gave up their citizenship, and so they would write that as well, and they often said, went to Stuttgart, went to Frankfurt, and so that way, or went to America, so you can find that information as well. They also listed in the civil records who was on the community council, and you can imagine how important that was to be on that powerful organization in a local community. So they would list it, and then they would say who was elected. Now, I did try to figure out how many people voted for whom and how that worked, but I never really figured out how many nominees you were allowed to vote, so I never really could figure it out. But you can see in the 1850s, we finally had a Jewish member of the community council in this village. Financial status. We all want to know, how were they? Were they wealthy? Were they poor? Were they struggling? How was their life? Well, of course, the list of taxpayers can be very useful, but really you want to know how many assets, what they really had. And the way to do that is finding the wedding contracts and documents. These had to be registered at the village archive, in the village hall, so to speak, and for every marriage. Now, sometimes these documents were refiled with the estate documents, with the inheritance documents, so you have to look both places. Here is a typical contract, and you can see the number of the contract by chronological order. So once you have that marriage date from the family register, it really is easy to find the contract. And then, once you find it, you can find out what they have. Now, don't even need to know what the words are, but he didn't have any of something, which I now know is property, but he had some money. And you can do by comparison, and actually in my book I have a little comparison of how much a cow cost compared to how much somebody owned at that time. For instance, a cow was 300 gulden, and this person had 2,500. So obviously very well off, but he didn't have any property. And then they would list the trousseau. And this was fascinating because they listed everything down to intimate apparel, to everything else they owned in the house, in their household, or what they owned. And here, for instance, they had a silver belt buckle. Under books and paintings, they had a silver-plated prayer book, which I always love seeing, and then clothes. Now, she was quite wealthy, and so she had some silk dresses. But sometimes, literally, they had the shirt on the back, and they wrote one shirt. And, you know, it can be all that way. Also, in these documents, they have signature pages, and so that way you can see if your ancestors were literate. Sometimes they would sign, for instance, for my family, they would sign in Hebrew. Sometimes they would just do little X's, and sometimes they'd do little zeros. But you can see how the generations went, and when especially the women became literate. Well, poor old Gustl. When you look at her eyes, which actually growing up, it's quite interesting. Growing up, these paintings were very, very shiny. And when we had them professionally copied for my books, we had to have them, done with special lighting. They were very, very shiny, and they were over the fireplace. And do you know, I never noticed her eyes were weird. That's how out of it I was. And it's funny because the family used to talk about who has the pearls. But no one ever talked about her eyes are really weird. And I found the answer in the documents, because in the wedding contracts in the 1830s of her sons, it said that she could not sign because you can see the word right here. It's the same word, Linden. So now I feel badly about making fun of her, right? And then it said that the mother could not sign because her face had been robbed. This was in the 1830s. She lived to 1860. Now, even in these newspapers, they tend to spell people's names wrong, but you know the story, so you know you have the right thing. So in the 1850s, he came to America. Thus far, I've only talked about the people who lived in the little village, but what can we find if we go to the city or the town archives? Basically, it's the same type of information, but they have even more resources. As I said, once that I knew that my great-grandfather, Moses Katz, was living in Rottweil, I had to zip down there and start doing research there. What I found, obviously, was not Murrigan. This is a city that's quite substantial and quite a tourist town. Even now, it's a Catholic town with still has large churches and beautiful homes that they've kept up. It's quite impressive. But since the Middle Ages, no Jews had been allowed to live in Rotweil. They were expelled during the Black Plague. So Moses Katz would have had to travel by foot, maybe by horse, maybe by carriage, I don't know, about 8 hours south of Murrigan every week to do business in the area. So that meant, as of 1780, I had to start doing research in the city archives. Now, the best place to find information in the city archives are the city council record books, where they wrote down everything, pages and pages and pages of every detail of every discussion that was held. Now, an index sounds great, easy, no work, but you have to realize that Moses Katz is listed here under M. They would also list them as Jews under Jews or Israelites. And I would think, actually, for the Christians, you'd have to watch out to see if they did farmer so-and-so or if they owned a pub by the name of the pub. You have to be smarter than the indexer, who you can imagine is just whipping through it and doing it as fast as he can. But, of course, the indexes are very useful. And then the pages, which took me a long time to figure out, go page 1, 1B, 2, 2B. So if you're looking for something that's a B, you just have to look on the reverse side. But once you figure out the system, it's okay. Well, the transactions about Moses Katz actually were very important for the town, and they were documented in minutia in the minutes books because he became a purveyor to the army during the Napoleonic Wars. So he was a peddler in Murrigan, moving up the status to being a purveyor to the military. He also gave a large loan to the city of Rotweil. But what happened in 1799 was Napoleon's army came to the town and said, we don't want grain like we usually do. We don't want animals like we usually do. We want money. But the treasury was empty. So the town turned to Moses Katz, and they asked Moses Katz to buy the silver and the gilt silver that was owned by the churches and the guilds and the cloisters. Now, you can imagine this was very traumatic for a town to have to give away their treasures like this. Well, I couldn't find this document. I had read about it in the books. I couldn't find it. And one day, I just plopped this big document volume down, and I said, I give up. And what did it do? It opened to the page with a contract because someone had just shoved it in because it wasn't part of the minutes. It just shoved it in randomly. So that was just one of those things that happens. But what it shows, and again, all I had to do was do Moses Katz, and you can see the name spelled differently, but you know it's the same Moses Katz. And it tells the story about how he saved the town. This event was chosen by the German publisher of the German edition of my book. Could you raise it up? Raise it up, way up, way up. It's When Moses Katz Saved His Town from Napoleon. And this is not Napoleon's hat. It's actually the hat that the rabbi was wearing in the 18th century. Because they said, why is Napoleon's hat on it? It's not. Actually, it was a typical hat, and the rabbi was wearing it. So this is what the German publisher chose. I had no input whatsoever, but it did work in Germany. Well, often transactions began at the local level, went to the county level, went to the district level, went to the state level. Decisions were made at the state level, back down to the district level, back down to the county level, back down to local level. Now, aside from creating a lot of paper that we have to photocopy, the benefit is that they usually repeated the story or the fact situation in each document. So if you can't read someone's handwriting, you can read the next handwriting. But the downside of this is all these documents are in different archives. So actually, you are photocopying like mad, and it's only when you get home and actually input the information in your computer can you get the chronological order. And sometimes these are just days apart. So you'll see, September 5th and then September 6th, and they really moved it up. Sometimes it took longer, but you could follow it that way. So these are the type of archives that you have to go to when the state documents are involved. Now, I should say that the history books that was able to get in Germany or from interlibrary loan, great source we should really take advantage of, helped me, because what I did is every year I made a huge list of citations. I would usually photocopy the pages so I wouldn't mess up the citation from these books, because that way I knew what I was looking for in these state archives, which you can imagine are very complex. Well, this is great, except they moved the state archive material from archive to archive. So I would whip in the first day. They loved me at the state archives. I'm looking for this. We have no idea. And I'm looking for this. Sorry, it's been moved. So this can happen to you, but you still have a roadmap of what you're looking for. So this is the type of document. Want to bring this down? Yeah. This is the type of document you're going to see in the state archives. And you're going to see how easy it is, because this is the summary. And what am I looking for? Moses Katz. That's it. Photocopy. That's simple. You know, and so when the Germans are sitting there, you know, one page for 16 hours, I'm whipping through and putting photocopy pages in, because that's the way you're doing it. Now, sometimes it's absolutely nothing, but sometimes it's really important, and you need to have it photocopied. So that's how you do it. It's very simple. You'll have, if you really care, you can see this is the Ministry of Interior and a date. That's it. Now, obviously, if you have a name that's distinct, it works. You know, for some of you, it might be more difficult, but maybe it would say so-and-so from a town, and that would help differentiate from so-and-so as well. Excuse me. Well, these techniques broadened out my research, because I realized I wasn't just researching my family. I wasn't just researching my extended family. Actually, I turned out to be researching the history of the rural Jews in the whole area of South Germany. I certainly didn't expect to start like that by any means. But what happened was that you have to do these multi-layer searches. And Moses Katz actually was allowed to live in Rottweil in 1803. And a few years later, he wanted to buy this very impressive building, which was right down from the village of the city hall. Well, you have to have all your house contracts ratified by the city council, and they said, Jews are not allowed to own houses in Rottweil. Well, what I really loved about Moses Katz is he never took no for an answer. So he said, I'm buying it. And they said, no, you're not. They said, we're going to check with the higher court. So in the state archive, I found this very long document, because you can imagine a higher court just can't say yes or no. It was like 50 pages, in which all I had to find was Moses Katz. They said once he had permission to live in Rottweil, he had to be allowed to have a building to do business. So he bought that fancy house. And that's where his store was, and the family store into the 20th century. Another type of multi-level research was related to Joseph David Berlesheimer. He was involved in important events in the 19th century. Again, I had no idea. Nobody had ever told me. But I had to trace it from the beginning. I started in the village archive, where we found his tax record. He was just in trade, and here you see his name. And the important thing is right around this year, because in this year, he was the highest trade taxpayer of all the Christians and the Jews. Then I found in other documents that he was the president, which we call Parnas, sometimes with a P, sometimes with a B, of the Jewish community, which is not surprising, because at the same time he was the richest Jewish person in the community, so obviously he got elected. And then in that first year, I had photocopied these old books from 1922 that were written about the history of the Jewish rights, so to speak, in Württemberg. And in a footnote, it said that Berlesheimer from Murigen was a signatory on some documents that related to Jewish emancipation. The Jews had to strive for equal rights with the Christians, and this took many decades. So in the 1820s, I knew that he had signed some documents. Well, not surprising, those documents had been moved, so nobody had any idea where they were. And I must admit, it took me, I would say, probably a week of going through stacks of documents, which I must admit the archivist, I know it's important, wanted all the pages lined up right when you brought them back and you had to do a special knot, which I never figured out how to do that silly knot. But the point was that after many days, I found his signature. Right there and right there. So he was actually part of the Jewish committees that sent petitions to the king and to the parliament in these initial stages of emancipation. Well, we return to the portraits. I learned about their lives, their struggles, what their families were like, what the villages were like, what their communities were like. In this program, I certainly could not include all the documents I found. I found over 2,600. Some were lined, but some of them were many, many pages. And I also found many sources about the rural Jews and the rural Christians living in South Germany. And that full bibliography, which is very long, it's about over 1,600 sources, is also available on my website, which is listed on your bookmark and brochure, which is why I gave it to you. I hope this talk has given you an incentive to go to Germany, to do your research. Has it? Yes. Okay, I don't want to hear you did it, I can't, okay? Oh, we have a few minutes for questions, or I know the banquet's tonight. If you have some questions, you're welcome to either come down tomorrow to 5:12. I'll be there in the morning, depending on the weather, for the afternoon. Yes?